Introduce our presenter, Lori G. Cook, Ph.D, CCC-SLP. I know that stands for speech-language pathologist because I have a girlfriend who's a speech-language pathologist. Dr. Cook, a certified speech-language pathologist since 2003, serves as the director of the clinical research at the Center for BrainHealth at the University of Texas at Dallas, and she also serves as a senior clinician for the Center's Translational Brain Performance Institute, as well as an adjunct assistant professor for UTD's School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Dr. Cook has also served as a site research coordinator for National Institutes of Health funded studies investigating the long-term recovery of higher-level language skills, as well as executive functioning abilities after brain injury in youth.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank y'all for coming. Can everybody, I know it's kind of a small screen, can you all see this okay? And can you hear me okay? Great. Well, since it is a small group here, if it's all right with you, I'd love to take a quick moment just to get a feel for who's in the room so that I can, kind of pick different topics accordingly. So how many of y'all here in the room are parents or family members of an individual who's had a brain injury? Yeah? Okay, I figured mostly. Do we have any folks in the room who are professionals? Excellent. Okay, so great. So what I'm going to be speaking about today, I know I use the word, you're going to hear me use the word strategies a lot, so I'm apologizing in advance. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean, more about what I mean, but a lot of my work is with children and teens who haven't just experienced their injury. So I don't work at a hospital or an acute care or rehab facility. Rather, I tend to work more with those kids and teens and young adults years down the road. We've been really fortunate to do a lot of research in our center. We're with the University of Texas at Dallas. We've been part of some of the longest running research studies following kids after brain injury in their recovery as long as we can. I have some young people I've been working with for over 20 years now. So we've learned so much. I'm sure you guys have all heard it said many times, and it's very true. No two brains are the same. No two brains are the same. So each person we meet and get to know and get to have these long-term relationships, we learn so much from. So I'm excited to share with you today some of the things we are really learning, not just from the research, but also to help support families and individuals, especially in sort of empowering and equipping our young people with brain injury to really take on some strategies, especially in some of these higher order skills that come down the line, things that are related to learning, communicating, also things that are related to executive functioning. So if they find themselves in that position where they're, able and starting to take on some more responsibility, what are some strategies we can talk about? Also, I honestly like to talk about things that are relevant for anybody with a brain. And so I'm also going to talk a lot about some of these lifestyle aspects. As somebody who studies really the developing brain, we're learning so much, for example, about, how is all this technology, that our kids are growing up with impacting their brains in good and maybe not as good ways. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So since this is a small group, feel free, if you have questions along the way, raise your hand. I'm happy to stop and answer. But I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So I mentioned I'm kind of from a unique place. I'm up in Dallas. And what's neat is, although we mostly do research, we actually now have the ability, research happens so quickly, especially when it comes to studying the brain, because we still only know this much, truly. We have so much to learn. So we're actually in a place where we not only do research, but many of us, like myself, are also clinicians or educators. So as we learn things, we're not waiting 40 years to try to get that out to folks who can use it. we want to turn that into services and programs. So I'm able to do that side by side, which is exciting. But a lot of people ask me, so what is brain health? Like, what does that mean? We all know what heart health is, right? You know, what it means to have a healthy heart and what those measures are, whether it's blood pressure, cholesterol. We don't have really good measures just for brain health at all, right? A lot of us, you know, it's so focused on maybe what are the things that we don't see working well in the brain, but what do we think about when it comes to brain health? And what we're recognizing is it's not just the literal anatomy of the brain, it's also your cognitive health. So how well, you know, you're able to use your brain for thinking and learning and making decisions. Also, the psychological health is an important part of brain health. So that well-being or helping folks, avoid addictions, things like this. Also, I love that we're starting to see social health being a really important part of brain health. And then, especially for those of us who are clinicians and certainly families, I think what's probably most important to us above all is that, you know, our loved ones and all of us really are thriving in our day-to-day. So helping us realize those goals and have that quality of life. So I always encourage people to think about having a healthy brain, not just in terms of are all your neurons firing and, you know, is it healing, but how are you using it? And is that, again, really helping you, meet some of those real life goals? So another thing we've focused on a lot, my mentor for the last 20 years is really one of the pioneers in helping us understand the impact of an injury on a developing brain. One of the really important findings that's come out of the research in the last 20 years is that kids are not just little adults, right? It's not true in any sense, medically or otherwise, but it's really true when it comes to the developing brain. So how a brain is impacted, say from an injury really early in life relative to later, can be very, very different. So we think it's really important that folks be mindful of the long term. You know, the younger you are, the more important it is to keep tabs on how they're continuing to not just heal, but also develop as they continue to grow. So, what that means is that we're starting to get more and more capability to provide that long-term monitoring. We use the example a lot of pediatric cancer. You know, if a child has cancer and they're treated and they go into remission, do their doctors just say bye and never see them again? No, they make sure that they continue to check up, come back, make sure they stay in remission. And it really should be the same with brain injury. We don't ever want a child to hit an age, take on some new challenges, and it seemed like that they're having to, almost recover some of these skills they may not yet have at a later date. So that's really important. Again, we've learned a lot over the years, and we put a lot of focus on some of these skills that especially come online down the road a little bit. So not those, some of basic skills early in life, but some of those more complex skills. What we've seen is that, especially for some of our younger kids who may have had an injury, and do, again, receive those wonderful rehab supports when it comes to not just the physical, but also the occupational therapies, also our speech and language and learning. See, a lot of kids really thrive given those supports. But again, we want to really set the stage for that long-term growth and development. And these are some of the areas, where especially if kids aren't supported, we might see some of those challenges kind of come out down the line because they do require so many important skills in the brain to be able to do. So how many of y'all, and you may be familiar with this idea. Do you know when your brain is considered mature, fully developed? At what age?
25?
25? Any other guesses? You're basically right on. Again, no two brains are the same, but for the most part, your brain's not fully developed until you're about 25. And we always joke and say that the rental car companies figured that out before the neuroscientists ever did. 35, they had to figure it out. So what that means is there's a lot of development that happens. And especially what I'm showing here, these are some brain scans that come from thousands of just typical developing kids that were done at the National Institutes of Health. And what they're showing is the brain becomes more purple. What's essentially happening is the brain is pruning. Just like you prune a bush to make it stronger, the brain starts to kind of cull down those unnecessary connections, become more efficient. And a lot of that is happening during these teenage years. And the parts of the brain where we especially see that are really in these frontal regions in the brain. And you know what kinds of skills our frontal lobes help us do? Is anybody familiar with the frontal lobes and some of the skills that part of the brain helps with? It's some of these higher level things like planning and reasoning, judgment, even things like emotional control. So you can imagine if a child has their injury before this part of the brain really comes online, we might see some challenges, once they hit that point in neural development. It's almost like building a house on a little bit of a shakier foundation. So we might not see some of those challenges come to light until they're really called into action. So to boil it down, one of the things we've seen a lot as therapists, as educators, as parents, is a lot of our kids with brain injury, especially those, you may have heard the term who have sort of an invisible injury. You may not be able to tell, if you see them walking down the street, for example, that they've had an injury. But many of these kids, and certainly kids, who don't have those invisible injuries, might actually be experiencing a lot of challenges in those real life functions. Again, whether it's school or behavior or socially, or again, just kind of how they're able to make progress on some of those day-to-day goals. And what's been challenging is we haven't had a really good system to help us figure out how to best identify and support some of these things, because they're not easy to see. So the long and short of it for you guys is it's a shame that when it comes to brain injury, if you ever look that up in the media, in the news, usually the headlines you're going to get are not good ones. They're not, it's the doom and gloom that sort of makes the headlines. And so I feel so sad that folks aren't more aware of the research that's being done, because most of the research is actually really encouraging, very hopeful, very positive. We're actually learning a ton about the brain's potential. In any stage in life, even after an injury. You guys have probably heard the term neuroplasticity. So the brain's capacity to change and grow. And we are learning more and more about how we can leverage that, right? To help potentially restore function, potentially to even regenerate functioning in the brain, and certainly to create stronger connections. And there's even this idea of building resilience, making your brain stronger so it's even more resistant to further injury, for example. So there's actually a ton of hope out there, and I love being that person who can really share this with families. They may not have gotten a lot of hopeful messages from the medical providers they've seen and so forth. So it's exciting to really help them see that absolutely there are things that we can do to help your child, your teen, make some improvements in those really meaningful real-life outcomes. So, where I've been, we've been really fortunate because as we've learned more just in general about the brain and how it works, we've been able to really take that to our treatments. And interestingly, my bread and butter is more in the cognitive domain. So again, how we're using our brain to think and learn and make decisions. And so as we've learned more about how we tick, it gives us better ability to build some good treatments and to even get involved at that level of teaching and academic supports. So just to give y'all a quick little tutorial in therapies, there are a lot of different approaches out there. One that y'all are probably all very familiar with are compensatory strategies. Have y'all ever heard this idea? So basically a tool that's going to help you maybe compensate for a challenge. You could think about, for example, if you have some challenges with your memory, having a calendar or a planner that you write things down in. You can think of this as a compensatory tool, something to help you kind of supplement that memory. But that's not the only tool that we have. There's also more of an approach that's called restorative. So again, we're learning more about the potential, given certain therapies, that we can actually restore a function, not just try to compensate for it, which is very exciting. There's also this idea of what we call habilitative treatment. This is really relevant for kids who are still developing skills, because basically what we're doing is we're looking ahead, we're forecasting what are some skills that we want to be sure that they have set the stage for, that they're going to be ready for. So let's start kind of building the foundation for those now. So a habilitative approach is not trying to regain a skill they already had, but rather to kind of strengthen the lead up to that skill they're going to be bringing on down the road. And then functional. Basically, all therapy should be functional, hopefully working on something that is directly relevant to something that they're doing in their day-to-day. So none of these stand alone. Usually, as a therapist, as an educator even, there are folks putting many of these things into practice. And you may be familiar with some of these ideas too. But I said that I'm going to use the word strategy a lot. What we're seeing more and more is folks are encouraging this idea of making your therapies and your supports, be sure that you have some strategy-based approaches. Something where you're asking, what tool is this child gaining to help them improve this ability, rather than just this being a chance for them to practice or drill a skill. So it's kind of like a tool that they can pull out anytime they need to use this skill. So hopefully you've seen some of this come out in some of the therapies you've been involved with, because in order to give someone a strategy, it's also important to include the families and the other folks the child is working with those ideas and strategies and tools as well. So what I'm going to do is jump ahead a little bit. One of the things that I do a lot is work with learning strategies. So I'm not going to spend too much time here because I really want to focus more on some of the executive function, but I think there may be some interesting information here to share, because this really is relevant to anybody who learns. We're actually finding out that our brain, we are not wired to be very good at downloading information. Are y'all surprised by that idea? We're actually not wired to be very good at that. That's kind of the most fragile kind of memory that we have. What we're really better at, kind of designed to be better at even, is this ability to get the gist of something. Yeah? Have y'all ever experienced this? Yeah. You're like, I'm experiencing it right now. And and it's unfortunate that we've kind of lost sight of this when it comes to education in many ways, and kind of our expectations as we go to school and learn. What we're finding is that at a brain level, it's really not about how much you can learn, but really how good you are at getting the gist. What's the point? And in the process, let me dump out the stuff I don't need, basically. So a really efficient brain is one that can cut to the chase, essentially, and get rid of all the stuff you don't need. If we don't do this, basically what we'll experience is information overload. So I think this is particularly important to think about as we support our kiddos with brain injury, many of whom may struggle with some of these aspects of memory and learning. And so there could be a tendency after an injury for the brain to immediately want to jump to, let me just try to remember it all. Let me try to pick up all these water bottles and hold them all. If you think about that, it's like the brain is trying to take it all in. There's not a filter. I use the example a lot. If I give a child a highlighter, they may give me back a solid yellow textbook. It's like, I'm just going to try to take it all in. And that's going to overload anybody's brain. So what we really want to do is help them get rid of the stuff they don't need. Let's make information more manageable so that not only will it be easier to remember, but it'll be easier to understand, right? Because if we don't do that, if you're stuck at, oh my gosh, this is just a lot of information, it's going to be a lot harder to figure out what it means, right? Or to do something with it. So I think one of the challenges we're faced with is this idea of, well, gosh, if our kiddos are feeling information overload, then how is this going to be compounded by the fact that we have more information coming at us every day now than any generation before us, right? So one of the big teen brain researchers out there had this quote, and I thought he hit the nail on the head for students. He said, one of the most useful skills for children and adolescents to acquire will be the ability to effectively use this universe of information, to critically evaluate the data, to discern signal from noise, so what's important, what's not, to synthesize the content, and then to apply it to real-world problem solving. This is actually what learning is all about. So I think it's important for us all to have that in mind as we support students, and certainly for our kiddos who may have some challenges. So one of the things we do when we work with kids is we talk about strategic learning. So again, not just dump all that information in your brain and see what sticks, but let's really work on this ability to summarize information. So instead of tell this story back to me, I'm going to ask a kid to tell you what, can you summarize this? Can you put this in your own words and just tell me the story in 3 or 4 sentences? So it's a totally different kind of skill in the brain because they're already having to make it their own. They're already having to think about what's important, what's not. What am I going to hold on to? What does it mean to me? So I think it's really important for us too to think about as we're communicating, how can we model that as well? Instead of focusing on quantity of information or overloading information, how can we really demonstrate how to cut to the chase and think about even sort of what's the take-home message here, for example. So there are a lot of ways we can start to encourage this skill for our students, especially if they're getting into that stage in school where they're having to read more or experience going to multiple classes with different teachers. How can we give them some tools to help kind of cut that information overload? One of the things we think about, I'm going to use a little model here. If this oval is a brain and all these shapes are pieces of information that they're taken in, what we're trying to avoid is this. What we want to help our kids do basically is this. Doesn't that feel more manageable? So how can we get that clutter, declutter the brain, and really then help them see how they can chunk information, see those big ideas, make those connections, and hold on to it. So I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. So the first kind of topic was all about learning and thinking about how we can really think smarter, not harder, when it comes to holding on to information. But I think one of the areas that's so relevant for a lot of families, especially as your kids are kind of entering those middle or high school years, is executive functioning. Are y'all familiar with the term? Have you heard this before? It's basically talking about all those higher order skills. Some I mentioned earlier, things like having to plan or problem solve, or use some good judgment, or control, regulate your emotions. So there are so many important ways that kids have to apply this. And in fact, when I describe it with kids, we talk about all these different elements. My brain's executive skills. There are aspects of memory here where you're having to not just remember something, but work with information. We call that working memory. Talking through problems in my head, for example. And then that really is big in planning. Handling those jobs or assignments that have lots of steps. Even things like knowing when I might need to ask for help. Planning ahead. Organization. This is something that we might see physically in terms of are they able to keep track of their things, turn in their assignments and so forth. Paying attention, being able to stay focused in class, and in the process ignore things that might be distracting them, or figuring out what is the key idea I need to focus on. And then really at the top of all this, another executive function is that emotional control. So, how can I start and end my work calmly, feel okay when changes happen, or when things are done a little differently than I'm used to? How can I handle being upset and frustrated, for example? So a lot of folks who help support kids in developing these executive functions will talk about metacognitive strategies. So basically all that means are thinking tools, or even little routines that they can build in to help them set up these skills. So for example, one of my favorites, as kids are at an age where they're going to need to start planning some things, or maybe making their own goals. There's one that you'll hear called goal, plan, do, review. So basically helping a child see that any task usually has multiple parts. Usually there's something we need to do before to get ready for it. Usually there's some things we might need to be mindful of while we're doing it. And then it's always important to look at how we did. Did we end up where we were expecting to be or not? Did anything go wrong? How might we do it differently next time? So things to get them thinking about what they're doing before, during, and after they do something, especially if it has a lot of parts. Sometimes it's about helping equip kids with those study skills and strategies, understanding time, and how to think about how to organize their time, how long something is going to take. And then there's some of those external aids they can use. So knowing what are the things that are really going to help you do this better consistently, things like checklists. So maybe it's a really simple thing you have in your home where there's a checklist by the front door that they check every day before they leave, and they start taking some responsibility for, do I have my bag? Do I have my jacket? Helping them build some of those skills to keep tabs and stay organized. Assignment books, it's wonderful now. We have so many tools like mobile device apps that can even help, kids be able to do this on the go. More and more have access to these devices and can use them to their advantage. So when I talk about executive function, I think a lot of people, if you have a child who's, in, let's say, a regular classroom, they're taking on starting to get into those longer term assignments, or they have lots of homework, it's not unusual for me to hear a story where a teacher will say, or a parent will say, gosh, I know they know the material, but gosh darn it, they are just not turning in their homework, so they're failing this class. And I know that doesn't reflect what they can do. So why can't they just turn in their work, right? It's not that easy. Think about how many steps there are along that chain to get from the teacher giving the assignment. There could be anything along this road that could go wrong, right? So first, the child needs to even take note of the assignment to begin with, hearing that, perhaps writing it down. My son, I have an 8-year-old who's in 3rd grade, and they have to do this now every morning. The first thing they do in the classroom, it's their responsibility to look at the board and write down the homework assignment. Then they have to take it home, and then they actually have to remember to do it at home. They have to be able to stay on task long enough. Well, they have to get started. Then they have to stay on task long enough to finish it. Then they have to remember to put it back, like back in the backpack, so that it can get back to school to turn it in. So whereas, a teacher, somebody may think this is a simple task to turn in their work, we know there are a lot of different steps it takes to be successful. So when we think about executive function, these are complex skills that they're having to put into practice. So how can we support them to be able to see that through? So, another thing we have to ask ourselves is, if we see a child struggling here, let's try to get to the root of maybe where that breakdown is most likely going to happen. Maybe it comes down to the academic side of it. Maybe they're having a hard time actually understanding the assignment. Maybe it's more organizational, kind of like the example I just showed, just getting things from point A to point B. Maybe it's motivational. Maybe they're really feeling overloaded or frustrated. Maybe it's situational. This child maybe has a lot of other activities going on, or a lot of siblings, and it's a really exciting household, and maybe they have a hard time finding that quiet place to work. Or maybe it's personal. Maybe there are other factors at play that could be impacting that. So again, when we see something like this, it doesn't always mean that there's one answer, or that challenge is the same for every child. So I mentioned earlier, this is one of my favorite tools, and gosh, my poor son, I already do it with him. Just thinking about anything that we need to do. All right, so let's identify what is the goal? What is it that you want to accomplish? And then let's go ahead and kind of think about what our plan is for that. How will I accomplish it? What kinds of materials might I need, or what information or what people do I need to talk to? Let's try it out. And while you're doing it, is this going okay? Have you encountered maybe an obstacle? And then at the end, how did it go? Did your plan work for you? If so, gosh, let's use that plan again. Maybe to do something similar. Or gosh, if it didn't, let's figure out how we would do it differently. So these are really examples of strategies that can help a child start to build up this ability to engage in these goal-directed actions, have a plan of attack, and really organize their thinking to do this. So one example I like is, let's say that they're going to make a goal. Let's say they've really had some challenges in, again, getting their assignments done and turned in at school. So I might work with them and say, all right, let's break this down. What's a goal we could do to help kind of turn this around for you? All right, well, my goal is I want to bring my planner to school every day. Let's just work really hard on just getting that assignment planner to school. So their plan might be, what can we do to make sure you remember to do that? Well, we thought, tell you what, if I see it as I'm about to walk out the door, I'll be more likely to take it. All right, good. So let's plan to put your planner in front of the front door when you go to bed. That'll be your cue. It's bedtime. Oh, let me put that next to the door. And then what we did is just had him keep track for 5 days, plus or minus a simple little sheet. Yes, I did bring my planner to school today. No, I did not. And we might see, oh, you know what, out of that 5 days this week, I only remembered that twice. So maybe we need to try a different plan. We actually found out, let's say that putting it by the front door wasn't working. He wasn't remembering at bedtime to do that. So instead, we decided to have him do it right after he brushed his teeth. He never forgot to brush his teeth. That was an easy trigger for him. So after he brushed his teeth, he would hang up that backpack with that planner in it, on his bedroom doorknob. He couldn't miss it the next day, and could have more success with it. So again, just some of these may seem so intuitive for those of us who have developed these executive function skills. But for a lot of our students, this can be challenging. So to be able to break it down and give them a tool to be more successful, it can be really, really helpful. Another thing that we do a lot with our kids is get them used to talking to themselves, basically. That's one of the important things you can do when you're getting ready to plan something, is to talk through it, right? So picturing what it is that you want to do and the steps you're going to take to get there. So thinking about how we can get them used to that narrative, talking through things. One thing I encourage parents to do is to voice your own talking through things. There are so many things we do every day that we're planning in our heads. Let's actually say those things out loud so our kids can hear them. Our kids can hear our planning process, and we can model that for them, because that's a skill that they can take on and really help them better develop their own planning and problem solving. Another strategy we use with really, younger kids is this idea of your future glasses. So thinking of if you have a problem that you want to solve, or something that you need to plan, let's put on our future glasses and think about what that's going to look like when it's all done, right? So just getting them in that mindset of looking ahead, planning ahead, thinking with the end in mind, if you've ever heard that before. So that can be really powerful for kids, engaging that visual system in the brain. So again, if it's an assignment, okay, what does that final product look like? It's a full sheet of math problems that are done. Okay, how can we get there? Maybe with organization, it's actually a visual of what a clean desk might look like, for example. For social situations even, what would it look like for us to have like a happy play group today? Some people use the acronym of MIND. Let's mime it. So like making an image. What do I look like in this situation? How am I moving? What are the steps? And then what's that emotion? How am I going to feel, when it's all said and done? So again, the theme here is really helping kids visualize, think ahead, and start to kind of talk through this idea of taking steps to get somewhere. So sometimes, like I mentioned, it's helpful if we model that, because we naturally do that. So kind of looping our kids into that process could be really valuable. I've seen some families use, especially in sort of the work zones, this idea of here's our get ready zone, here's where we're going to gather our materials. Like literally they'll have a yellow square on the table, and we'll put all our things there. Do we have everything we need? Then the green space is where you're actually working, doing your work. And then once it's done, we put it in the red space. That's what it's, what it's going to be when it's done. We've got it there, and we are complete. So it's this idea of thinking with the end in mind. I love the visual cues. This is something that can be really valuable for kids who we really want to help develop those organizational skills, whether it's a locker or a desk or their playroom. It's great to engage them. I used this tool just this week. We are in the process of moving, and as anybody can imagine here, when you're moving, a lot of times you start by getting rid of stuff you don't want to move. So I've collected a lot of things from my son's schoolwork over the years, so we've amassed 3 boxes worth. So what we've been doing is going through them one at a time, and we ask, is this a treasure or is this trash? Or is this a think about it? One where, let's come back to it. So treasure, trash, or think on it. Sometimes we may have some that are really important for school too, where it's for the test. So just a simple little mental tool to help them with that organization can be wonderful. We also see some systems folks will use for school, maybe a folder that actually has different parts. A part for their graded work, a part where they put their homework that needs to be done tonight, and then homework that's due tomorrow, and then homework that's due later, actually helping them visualize that not everything is due at the same time. So some things may need to be prioritized, done sooner than other things. So it's almost giving them a visual for sequence, for how to do things in an order that makes sense. Again, there's lots of cool technology now. There's a program out there called Seeing My Time that really helps a lot of kids with executive functions, where you can actually put magnets on a clock to help them gauge when they might need to shift or start something else, for example. So ways to help them track their time. And you know, there are a lot of great tools to help communicate this with teachers as well. So maybe an assignment sheet that spells it out for them a little better. Like, here's what I'm going to need to take home to do that assignment. Once I'm at home, here's what I might need to get. Markers, paper. When am I going to do this? Who's going to help me check it? And where do I put it when I'm done? So it's getting them to ask and think through those questions. Another thing I think of for older kids is there's a difference between a due date, D-U-E, and a due date, D-O, or at least there should be a difference. If those days are the same, then we know we're doing it at the last minute. So helping them think about the difference between, I know this is due next week, but when are you going to do it? Thinking ahead. So another thing to keep in mind, oftentimes, again, in the older grades, they might have a short-term project and one that's a little bit longer term. And our inclination usually is to just jump on the homework that's due tomorrow, and then if there's time, we'll work a little bit on that long-term project. And what happens? We never actually work on that long-term project. So we'll often encourage, let's do the opposite. Let's spend 10 minutes on that long-term project, maybe before we start our homework, to give them a chance to do that. So a lot of different ideas out there. So I guess one of the things I wanted to see was just plant some seeds today to let you know that there are so many wonderful tools at your disposal. You know, as your kids are, you know, at that stage where they may be taking on more responsibility and independence. So I encourage you to check out some of these tools, because these are things that we as parents can easily do in our households. One other resource I wanted to share with you, I strongly encourage families to check out. There is a parenting coach tool that is just so wonderful. It's at a website called understood.org. And what it does is you can actually pick your child's age and grade level, and then it'll have all these different categories. Like maybe there's a skill you'd like to help them build more independence, or maybe it's something specific with behavior and focusing in class. You pick your child's age and grade, and then they're going to give you some really easy, maybe about 8 different examples of things that you as a parent can work on at home to help them build that skill. So they'll tell you examples of even how you would say this, how you would demonstrate it. I love it when they actually tell you, here's what you can say. Here's how you explain this. Here's how your child can take that on. So these are really designed with a lot of our kids with brain injury in mind. So just some great tools to keep, and they grow as your child does. So get harder and harder as they are able to take on more. So I think my time is up. Has it been 45 minutes?
You know, I don't know.
I didn't get a good look on when we started.
Have the question and answers at
'Cause
30?
Yeah, because I'd be happy to I'll probably go ahead and wrap up there, because I know we got started late. But if anybody has any questions, whether they pertain to this or something else kind of in this universe, I'm happy to try answering your questions. And two, if you just really want, are looking for more information, please feel free to reach out. You can email me, which I've put up there. One of the programs that we do in Dallas, in fact, is we've been working so long doing research and helping follow kids in some of these skills after their injury that we now have a service that's out there. It's grant funded, but it basically allows us to do an assessment with your child. We focus a lot on the skills that we know can be vulnerable or are coming online a little later. Things like these executive functions, things like social skills, things like some of these learning challenges. We'll assess, but then we give the families a ton of feedback about it, and then really some strategies and recommendations as to how to help your child continue to grow in these skills. Another thing I do a lot is communicate with teachers. So if you're back in the school system, many teachers simply just don't know much about how to support kids who've had an earlier brain injury. And so a lot of what I do is education and helping build some of those bridges in knowledge. The neat thing about this program, though, is we like to make these assessments annual. So it also serves as a way to continue to kind of monitor sort of proactively how they're continuing to grow in some of these skills down the road and to be that long-term resource. So please feel free to reach out. We are, unfortunately located up in Dallas, but we're actually starting to grow some of our ability to even engage remotely and do things that way as well. So always happy to connect families as well. And I appreciate you all spending some time with me today. And thank you guys.
Thank you.